I would like to say thank you for the invitation to speak at this symposium. A special thank you to Kathleen Fitzpatrick and Kristen Mapes, who took care of everything and made sure I got here from far away, and quite a number of flights to get here. So thank you very, very much to the organizers of the symposium for your patience and your generosity during this time of planning and getting us all here safely. I thought of doing a more technical presentation when I was asked to be here. I had a lot of ideas. I've been doing work in digital humanities since 2005 when I was at the University of Virginia. And I had several things I wanted to do in this forum, but I figured out that talking about the journey of some of the pioneering work that was happening in Caribbean digital humanities may be useful in the context of the symposium. And I was right, based on the conversations and the discussions that we had for the past 2 days. I started my writing process thinking a lot about physical and intellectual locations and how my interest in this work began. So I think I will tell you a bit of a story, and it will describe to you best how digital humanities methodology and practice can facilitate knowledge production and preservation in cultures and contexts when that knowledge is under threat from nature, empire, or both. In 2015, 2 weeks after the close of the 7th annual Nature Island Literary Festival, a massive tropical storm named Erica hit Dominica, dropping approximately 20 inches of rain in about 6 hours. It washed away an entire village. 35 people died, many of whom were family members to each other. It was the first disaster of its kind in about 40 years. That year, I was the chairperson of the organizing committee of the festival and pushed the committee to select the theme Nature, Environment, and Caribbean Literature. I now feel like a witch. In my remarks at the opening event, I said these words, and I will quote from that talk. The theme aims to highlight and celebrate the ways in which Dominican and Caribbean writing have consistently relied on the natural environment for its metaphor and memory. The sea's history, its haunting of the Middle Passage, and the promise of the repeating island. We are one Caribbean, and our language, our idioms, our oral storytelling, proverbs, and our Nobel laureates all reflect the unity that we share in palm trees, breadfruit, and black and white sand. But we also have a sargassum problem, warming oceans, coastal erosion, deforestation, drought, uncharacteristic downpours, and problems with spending too much money on energy and food imports. Those don't sound like literary problems, but if you have ever read a book by Octavia Butler, Pauline Melville, or Unia Kempadu, it becomes easier to imagine how literature can help with that. So why the theme of nature and the environment? Because the global environment concerns of climate change affect us dearly in this region, and we need all sectors and all forms of education and awareness to sensitize us to our individual and collective roles in preserving our region and our planet. But the environment also matters because literature, with its power and empathy, with the way in which it can instantly magnify, isolate, and clarify our outer and inner mental and emotional muddiness, is key to helping us imagine a way out of the elements of our natural environment that threaten our social well-being. That was 2 weeks before Erica. I am a witch. So I gave this talk asking everyone to feel my urgency for the impending, what I felt so strongly somewhere in my spirit would happen eventually, for us to feel the now of climate change and use literature and art as a way to respond to that. Erica happened, and for the 2 years after Erica, I spent every day trying not to tell my students, I told you so, I told you so, I told you so, I told you so, and trying to get them to think differently about what happened. I didn't know when I was writing or reading those words that Tropical Storm Erica would hit 2 weeks later and give Dominica its first jolt of what I call living in the after, because climate change already happened. For the age of climate change has arrived. I did not know that 2 years later, in 2017, it would happen again with Hurricane Maria to catastrophic ends. I feel conflicted even as I tell this story because I did not want to give any more talks about my digital humanities work in the Caribbean that are centered on disaster. In fact, I was conflicted about addressing the hurricane at all this time around. I had spoken about its impact on me and Create Caribbean on a number of occasions in similar spaces since September. Live stream and live tweet culture also made me hesitate so as not to be a broken record about our collective trauma from Hurricane Maria. But here's the thing. This is where we are. The age of disaster is now part of the mundane details of my life and scholarly work. It is the new normal, and any discussion of digital humanities, especially as they pertain to the global south and vulnerabilities created out of a history of empire, must take into account the reality of this global impact of climate change. The more I thought about how I wanted to tie in the topics that matter to me the most, reading, literature, and libraries, with digital humanities and the concerns of climate change, the more I returned to this question of the archive. Jacques Derrida's concept of archive fever was most palpable when I considered how I was driven to uncover and recover Dominica's history and Caribbean history and culture more broadly, that the work of building an archive is an act of thinking through it, reading through the context, feeling conflicted, finding a way to fight to make sure that everybody sees it and everybody understands it and everybody wants to save it as much as you do. I titled this talk There and in This Place because I was inspired by Derrida's thinking about the archive, and because I wanted to think about the process of engaging a new generation of historians, archivists, and DH practitioners in the very specific environment of the Caribbean basin. I had, as I had argued elsewhere, scenes and active readings and first encounters with historical or literary texts as a prime way that Caribbean people have shaped their identity, whether through education, through intellectual behavior, through intellectual activity, and through social and collective reading. So this is where I enter this room. This is my thinking when I got here. And I want to tell you about me getting back to Dominica in the first place, because that helps you understand the story too. I moved back to Dominica after completing my degree in the United States and working at a liberal arts college in Washington, D.C. in 2013. And I first decided to move back to Dominica after a summer research trip that inspired what would become later Create Caribbean. That summer, my head was not focused on working with high school or undergraduate students in digital humanities at all. My focus was on research of a more traditional type, a monograph on Caribbean readers. This book, as you heard, is still forthcoming. Needless to say, I got distracted in the best possible ways. But I started this journey toward Caribbean digital humanities with an assumption, well, an argument, that acts and scenes of reading in the context of the colonial and post-colonial Caribbean were important ways through which West Indian identity sort of cataloged itself in the annals of history. Acts of reading were resistance and self-determination for a society that was only taught to value the utilitarianism of literacy. The pioneers of Caribbean literature defied this expectation of colonial education and built a canon, Nobel Prizes included. When I went to do this research, I began my experience with 3 resources: the Dominica Library and Information Service, the West Indiana Collection at the University of the West Indies in Cayville, Barbados, and the Digital Library of the Caribbean. 3 very different types of sources. I encountered many disappointments, absences, but also many successes and treasures through those encounters. But I learned also that there was a space in what was happening there that needed to be filled. Things were missing. Conversations that were happening in New York and not in Barbados or Trinidad or Dominica or St. Lucia. Questions that I had from the archives could not be answered by the librarians there because the information was stuck in the British Library somewhere and we could not access it. Not even a paywall could get us through it. So there were questions, and I started getting concerned about the state of the archives. I started getting concerned about the state of the public libraries, and I started getting concerned about where Caribbean literature came from and why we didn't have a place to keep these historical and literary records. And I started doing a number of things in that process. I wrote a proposal for digitization of the National Archives newspaper collection in Dominica, which was one of the products of my research that summer. That proposal still hasn't been funded or accepted by the government because the National Library is a government entity. So there were some difficulties in getting not only the people who work in the system to value the benefits of that, but once we had that enthusiasm, once we captured that the right audience, the librarians are always on board, there was a trouble in selling it to everyone else. And so part of my work since that time, and my decision to move back, was about this agenda I had to bring this relationship between my desire to do this work on Caribbean readers and Caribbean literature, and this question of what is happening to the things we need to read, right? And so I started looking more at what the state of the libraries were, and that brought me to some interesting stories about the Caribbean and what is happening with libraries in the Caribbean. Libraries are, for the most part, in most of the islands, you will find that when I speak of the Eastern Caribbean specifically, I'm talking about the chain of islands that is really south of the Virgin Islands. And so we're speaking of the smaller islands of the Caribbean. Trinidad, Jamaica, and Barbados are referenced in another quote I will talk about in a while because they have major university campuses in the University of the West Indies. And so their academic libraries have helped to sort of drive a public, move that mission to have public. They were also larger outposts for colonialism, and so there was a larger financial investment in ensuring that they had those services because they had a larger population of colonial settlers as well who would make use of those services. And so for those reasons, you will find that the Eastern Caribbean was sort of left behind in that expansion of the library system. So the libraries were mostly gifts of the colonial era. In Dominica, for example, they were, the Carnegie Foundation was going all around the Caribbean, giving money at this time for the installation of either educational material, libraries, and things of that nature. And Dominica was one of the beneficiaries of that fund. The Carnegie Foundation helped to build the public library in Dominica in 1907. There is a sign on the building that says Free Library 1907 that's carved into the wall. You can still see it today. So that's one of them. But libraries in the Caribbean have a special sensibility that is a particularly colonial sensibility, and you will find it if you are a reader of Caribbean literature. You will see it in the literature all the time reference. People go to the library and everything is supposed to be nice. And Jamaica Kincaid, in A Small Place, really talks about this actively. She also talks about it in her fiction, not just in the essay. And so you will find these images of books and reading in library spaces quite popular in Caribbean fiction. So it's something to look for the next time you're reading, how people talk about books and their relationship to books. V.S. Naipaul talks about it as well, quite frequently. And so it's libraries and book ownership, both private and public, become a really important metaphor to think about knowledge and intellectualism in the Caribbean. And that's why, for me, in years after my dissertation was complete, I was telling my friend, you know, how did I not think about this? The library is the thing, right? And so I'm happy that my research in digital humanities has brought me back to this question of the library. You see how Jamaica Kincaid speaks of the library with reverence, that it is beautiful to people like me with its wide veranda, its big, always open windows, its rows and rows of shelves filled with books, its beautiful wooden tables and chairs for sitting and reading, the beauty of us sitting there like communicants at an altar. So it is this sort of sacred space that has assigned to people who have the class ability and the intellectual access to come to these spaces. And you will find this, V.S. Naipaul talks about this in one of his essays as well, and he talks about this in some of his fiction. It was very important for them to have the books and have them on the shelves in their house, even to have private libraries at their house. But no one was really interacting with the books, you know, and one of his novels really plays on this as a parody. There's a whole satire about this. It's really comical in the way he renders it, that he keeps buying these books and putting it up there, and everybody thinks he's the smartest guy in the town just because he has the books, but he hasn't read 1% of the books in the house. So there are these interesting plays on this idea of ownership of texts as being tied to intellectualism, and the way that having them at home is also classed, and why public libraries then become very, very important to that enterprise in democratizing knowledge in the Caribbean. Academic libraries are sort of absent from this conversation, except, like I said, in the countries where you have the University of the West Indies campuses in the 1960s. So we are going into a period where the countries are starting to become independent. And so they are becoming to expand. The regional universities being formed, and these larger outposts are beginning to have more resources. Alma Jordan is sort of the quintessential librarian of the Caribbean. She's a retired university librarian of the University of the West Indies, and she is the most prolific person in documenting the history of libraries in the Caribbean. And she's made these observations about what was happening with free libraries, public libraries. In 1933, only three free libraries existed in the whole area. Those are Barbados, British Guyana, and San Fernando, Trinidad. All the libraries suffered equally from poor book stocks. The mainland colony of British Honduras had no public library at the time altogether, although a scheme had been prepared. And so, although there were libraries coming up and the Carnegie Foundation was funding these things, were they accessible to all people at the time? The fiction will also tell us that they were not, right? I study one author, Phyllis Chan Alfrey, who writes about Dominica and the specific library, and references in there how the library was used by the Creole girls to go as a space for them to go when their mothers needed time alone. And there's no mention of the black children in the book using this library space and the black children having to borrow books from their house, from the Creole girls' house, in order to be able to read. So there's all these issues with access that are tied to the free library system in the pre-independence time of the Caribbean. And then Jamaica Kincaid returns with us. In the 1980s, she goes to observe Antigua. So after they build up these beautiful, magnificent buildings that people may or may not have access to, they tear them down or something happens. There's no maintenance of these buildings, and they end up in complete destruction. And so she laments this when she goes to see the library in a storefront on Market Street and says, the library is now above the dry goods store, right? And talks about really this idea, as you will see in the quote, that it's not just that the quality of the material, but is the quality of the training of the librarians as well. And so she's commenting here on the fact that this type of intellectual, this knowledge production and knowledge preservation is just given no value in the culture and no value in a space where we expect free Afro-Caribbean people to be self-determining and to be working toward modernity, right? So there is this conflict here between what you need the most in order to move to this next level of development is inaccessible to you, either by class or either by the access to the resources to maintain it. And so the colonial governments at this time are giving no value, and into independence, there is still no regard for the value of this knowledge production. So as we see here, we have a long history of this, and this goes way back to C.L.R. James in the 1930s writing about this in his novels. And you see in this literature, I'm bringing this literature together with the sort of state of the libraries as they were, because the intellectual producers in the Caribbean at the time are the creative writers, right? So C.L.R. James, who is one of the greatest Marxist philosophers of the 20th century, is telling us in his novel, the only published novel that we have of him, Minty Alley, this construct between his main character, Haynes, who is reading alone in his room. He works at a bookshop, and he's hiding all this little knowledge from the women in the yard, working in the yard, and they're judging him for that, but they're very smart and street smart, and he has no skills. He has no social skills, none whatsoever, and they end up in this sort of exchange program where he's feeding them books, and they're feeding him like how to talk to the girls, how to do all these things, right? So there is this moment where he realizes, I need these people, and these people are valuable, and they end up in these moments of exchange where their knowledge sharing becomes a really important part of the development of this sort of yard society that's built in the yard. And so we see this in that moment. Then we get to the 1940s when all of these writers start to move out of the Caribbean in the Windrush era. So after World War II, you see a big push out of the Caribbean, right? And what happens then is everybody takes the right, anyone who wanted to be a writer, George Lamming talks about this, moves to England, and they get on that ship. And what happens there, a white man named Henry Swansea puts a show on BBC called Caribbean Voices. And that's how literature gets disseminated in the Caribbean. So the writers go into the studio, they record their pieces, they record their fiction, and then they send it back to the Caribbean. So you're sitting in Dominica or in St. Lucia listening to the radio and learning for the first time what West Indian literature is. Right? This is a really interesting dynamic that we see. What's special about this technological shift was the attempt to sort of spatially redirect knowledge production as if in a circuit. So you're seeing the same type of movement, migration pattern of literature, and not just literature, there were all kinds of other extra activities happening, sort of social, informational programs that were on the shows. But what is happening is this knowledge is coming out from the Caribbean on a ship and coming back through the radio waves. And there's never a point where the publication is happening there until some of these same writers, and some of them who chose not to leave or not to stay away when they went, Earl Lovelace, Kamal Brathwaite, you have a bunch of them returning to the Caribbean who say, wait, we can do our own thing. We don't just need this space, right? And so they start printing these literary journals. Beam, Kai Coverall, there are a few of them that get really popular from this time. Guess where they live? The records of most of these are in two places. Some are at the University of the West Indies. The next location is at the University of Austin at Texas. I've seen them there, right? So we're talking a lot about dislocated knowledge, right? A lot of our archives are somewhere else. So most of these collections are in the University of Texas at Austin. I've seen some of them in Cayville in Barbados, but they are nowhere. Now that we have access, I was speaking to one of the team members at DLOC, the Digital Library of the Caribbean, and they're saying that we have rights access to get them digitized. So there are all these layers involved in making those things accessible to the public. So even though they did make these journals, and there was a proliferation of young writers coming in there, people who were not writers by profession, but were trying to test their waters in writing, coming into these publications. But no one was still having access to them. These things were not ending up in library spaces. They were just people who knew people who were buying them or sharing them with each other. So you have this session where there is still no free democratized space, like what a library should function as to make these texts available to people. So that's why Jamaica Kincaid really expresses this frustration at not only the sort of intellectual robbery that happens when you do not invest in knowledge production in the place where you have already come in and taken, but she then comes and says, well, you don't even have the respect to put it in a nice place anymore, right? Because there were challenges with the library system that even the texts in the library were old and archaic and foreign. And I will tell you again, you spend some time with Caribbean literature and you see how angry the narrators are about describing this. Jean Rhys has a really good story about some of this. The Day They Burned the Books is one example of how they treat knowledge that is foreign in the Caribbean and how they are so disconnected from the texts that were available to them in the library. One of the most famous symbols in Caribbean literature is the daffodil. And the reason the daffodil is a proliferating image is because of Wordsworth. And the Wordsworth image keeps coming up everywhere, and no one has ever seen a daffodil, right? And so no one knows what that looks like. So there are all these examples of this remote nature of what is accessible in the sort of scanty libraries that they do get. And so her frustration just boils into anger, and she has this sort of diatribe in a small place. And she gets a lot of flack for that. Even Antiguan people at the time this thing is published are saying, why are you talking about this? This is embarrassing, that we should be grateful, right? So when we get to this point where the narrator says, you know, she sees that her relationship to the library as her own sort of taking ownership of her intellectual mastery back from England. She uses that space for that reason. We can understand why she is astonished and appalled at what she sees when she sees Market Street in this example. The image of this irreparable colonial library also memorializes severed ties between West Indies and England. And it means that this union is an ultimate form of misrecognition. The library highlights that difference forever between people like me and people like you. But then we have a problem. The people like you still have our stuff, and we want it back, right? So there is this session. So this is where I enter. I have this history in my head about how all this relationship between libraries, readers, and this absence of space for readers to get more material to read in the Caribbean and more of material that looks like themselves in this space. And so my search for West Indian readers, when I began my dissertation, sort of culminated in a very angry experience, it started as, with a novel by a woman named Andrea Levy. And I like to tell this story. It's my fun story, because Andrea Levy was my lesson in humility as a scholar, right? I started this experience reading this novel in a class at grad school, and my advisor, who was the professor for the class, we were very angry all the time. We had read all the Caribbean things, and we said, this is just a lesser, really mediocre text, and it's every other author had done this before, but you know why we don't know about these other texts and nobody in the class knows about it? Because you have our stuff. So all of this stuff is foreign. All of these books were published. No one in the Caribbean is reading it. No one in England had read George Lamming's Emigrants. Lonely Londoners wasn't a popular text. Many of these books were out of print, right? And so our frustration was, here is this nice, shiny new novel coming along by this woman. We're very happy for her. She's nice. However, everybody has done this before a few times. And I spent an entire chapter writing about how everyone else had done it before. Right? And while I was doing that, I said, well, let's really talk about what's wrong with that, or why is that wrong, right? And what I figured in that process wasn't that she really tapped into this history of migration to write a new novel. If you've never read Small Island, you should. It's funny. There's also a BBC miniseries on it with Benedict Cumberbatch and Naomi Watts. It's actually good. So it was really well done. So once I got into this book, two things were really interesting about the book. One, that it was being used as part of a national reading campaign in England at the time. Two, it was also being used to commemorate the 200th anniversary of the abolition of slave trade in England. And one of the things that was tied with that was they had this banner said, British multiculturalism is here, right? There was this big multiculturalism. So then it was problematic on top of problematic. But what I did like about what they were doing was the way in which this book was being sent out to public libraries everywhere. And no matter what the age, there were programs tied to this book to allow people to get to know the Caribbean. This book has 4 narrators. 2 are British people and 2 are Jamaican. And it's a really interesting story that's well told. But what happens then is that they make a website, and there's this entire digital platform that's tied to learning about the book. So as you read the book in whatever library you are, you can also click on all the different elements. So there's a link on there that says, learn about the slave trade, learn about multiculturalism in England. So it's sort of a tutorial online that's tied to this reading campaign while they're at the same time promoting this sort of new Britain, right? This new multicultural Britain, as if we don't know that what is in the book is sort of really telling the scathing story of how the doors were slammed in the faces of these 2 people when they came to England in 1948. So there are these stories happening in the text while this book is being used to commemorate how far we've come from that, right? So I found that that part of the book really redeemed the fact that I felt really violated by that, but it still didn't solve the problem of this violation, right? It still didn't solve the problem that a lot of texts were sort of lost in the canon or lost in the sort of cultural memory of Caribbean literature as a result of this one brand new text that is doing all these things. And so and more so because many of these writers of the migration novels had literally left their homes and moved to England to make this possible, right? So I had to find a way to really think about how I was going to reconcile this particular issue with Small Island and what Small Island taught me about the power of using technology as a way to sort of create this global community around reading, to the way in which libraries were used as part of that experience to bring a larger public into the conversation about what the Caribbean is and the value of the contribution of the Caribbean to a metropolitan space. And then 3, thinking about the ways that Caribbean writers then can learn from this experience a new way of sort of making sure or marking themselves in the history of Caribbean writing globally, right? So there are multiple things that were happening here. So with this experience from Small Island completed, and I wrote about it, and I felt, again, I felt redeemed by I was giving her a break, and I said, this isn't so bad. I got over it. I thought I even enjoyed the jokes in the book after that. I wanted to see what we had in the Caribbean that we could use to do similar things. And I found nothing. I have one press in Dominica who I've published with, and she also has her press housed in England for a reason, because there's no way we can afford to publish from Dominica, so all the printing happens actually in London. That's Papillon Press. I went to other islands. I worked when I moved back when I started going back home regularly in 2012 and moved back, I became an active member of the Literary Festival and worked with regional writers and local writers on all kinds of projects to learn a little bit about how do we get people in the Caribbean to read about people in the Caribbean. That was the central question. I went to all the libraries I could find. I went to Guadeloupe. I went to St. Lucia. I went to Barbados. I went into Dominica. I went all to the libraries, and I asked them what they had. Grenada doesn't have a library, and it was Unia Kempadu, one of the authors, and a friend of mine, who actually was one of the original people to form a community library that is now getting some support from the government after they've really put in a lot of grassroots work to build a new space for the library after the library and archives got abandoned, right? So there is a narrative. I found later on that Dominica was actually doing pretty good. We had received a grant to preserve our archives, and so our slave registers, our newspaper collections, all of those manuscripts and archival records were really in good shape compared to other islands. We had a lot of good support for that. We had strong community programs at the library system. We didn't have enough space, and we had this old building that was not conducive for holding books. This is the building, as you will see in the pictures here. It looks exactly the same from the 1920s. And this is it after Maria. I will tell you a little bit more about this after Maria picture later. It's very upsetting. So while I'm going all these islands trying to figure out how do we get Caribbean books in the hands of Caribbean children, especially in the hands of Caribbean youth, I'm also working to figure out how can we preserve what we do have and get back what was sent away. I worked with one family during the literary festival. Her father's name is Ralph Kazemi, and Ralph Kazemi was a poet, but he was also the national agent in Dominica for the Black Starliner. And he has a really interesting story of working with Marcus Garvey on the Black Starliner movement. All his records are at the Schomburg in New York City. So I can tell you more and more of these stories of names that the children in the classroom, the students in my college classrooms will never hear about because there's no access to their material either at the public level, in the public libraries or in the archives, right? The other thing about the public libraries that's really important for this story is that all the West Indian collections are in reference. We do not have enough of the things that are about us to have them in constant circulation. And you will notice that in a lot of libraries. Some fiction you will find, especially fiction that is in current print or that is maintained in classrooms, especially if you go to the University of the West Indies, you will find the texts that are being taught will be available for circulation. But for the most part, every West Indian collection you will find in an Eastern Caribbean library is a reference collection. Circulating material is almost non-existent for West Indian texts. That becomes an issue. And how can we solve that problem? Technology can help us solve that problem in a lot of ways because now everyone has a phone. We have 132% mobile penetration in Dominica, but we only have about 46% broadband penetration, right? So there are issues in terms of how we can make those things accessible to students in their hands. Also, a Kindle book is at $15 is about 45 local dollars, right? So we're looking at exchange rates and all of those reasons why the economy of reading becomes a factor in what students can afford and what students, what access they have, and why the public library and school libraries then become a space where that really, really matter to making sure that the texts that are in them are the most valuable. So I'm telling all of this before I get to Create Caribbean for a reason, because that's why I'm here. This is what it looked like before inside. So you see, it wasn't exactly pretty. It wasn't exactly what you would expect to see in a modern library in the before picture either. But the after was really bad. And we do have a national museum. It's only being used for the most part. It's closed most days, and it's only being used as a tourism information center in the front door on the left, on the ground floor. The building in the other picture is one of the branch libraries in the town of Portsmouth. And this is what happened after Maria. You will see that the designers, I was telling some of our colleagues in the room yesterday, that the designers didn't take into account that you shouldn't put a skylight in the middle of a circulation room, because no librarian was actually at the meeting to design the building. And so the skylight was already a problem before the storm. So when the hurricane came, that blew out first, and then the wind just came through and took everything else out. That library is actually getting a lot more support than the main library or the branch libraries, because we have a donor who's going to donate to repair that library and put the collections back. So this one is going to be okay. But there is no path for the main library system or the other branch libraries at this time. So this brings me to talking about the way that all of these three parts that I've talked about so far brought me to a place of what I describe as archive fever, right? I founded Create Caribbean Research Institute because of the convergence in my mind of that search for Caribbean readers, the desire for defining and expanding the Caribbean historical record, my search for an intellectual community linked to my own desire as a Caribbean person in love with literature, and my desire to find community around the impact of language on my own identity and sense of belonging. I'm also a really good teacher. And I like to teach. It's fun, right? So I wanted to have a space where I think that I could catch the students before they became jaded by the fact that we don't have nice things in the Caribbean. I wanted to get them at their hopeful place and sort of bewitch them into thinking that this is all their idea and it's going to be great. And so after lots of conversations and beer and coffee with a lot of my colleagues and friends, Create Caribbean was what I came up with. It took me about 13 months from concept to registration of it as it existed. And it was really a space for me. And I want to talk about that space. It was about my commandment. When Derrida talks in this essay about what is an archive, it's about commandment and commencement, right? It's about you ordering things and you beginning something new, always in the making. So it's always about starting new and creating an order out of it. And it was about me creating an order out of my intellectual life. I had quit my job to move back to the Caribbean and do this. And I wasn't quite sure what it would look like at that time. But this was what was going to make it happen, and for me to be able to have intellectual space to do the work I wanted to do in the Caribbean without feeling like I needed a sort of university affiliation to do it. And that was an important part of that story. So I also had this really important part, which was civic engagement and working with the Literary Festival as a way to do that. But also one of the programs that we did with the Literary Festival, where I started to test out how this would actually look in real time, was a children's workshop. We went to different communities and taught, we did literary workshops with the students. We did readings, they did some creative writing, but we also added a digital media element to it and had them create projects using animation. We used open source stuff from MIT, Scratch, and App Inventor at first. And we had them build little projects in these spaces that were tied to their literary interests, that were tied to telling good stories, right? So whatever those stories were, we have them. And that was how I figured, okay, this will really work if I do it in a more structured environment and a more long-term environment. I wanted to really create a relationship between the library, this idea, this need that I had to preserve. I could give a whole other talk on why preservation was important to me. It's something that really tied to my family and our family history with intellectual activity in the Caribbean. That was really important to me, but also ICT was a hot topic in the Caribbean. everyone in the Caribbean was talking about information and communications technologies and how useful they would be for national development and regional development. And everyone was talking about ICT as though it was a prize to be won, and they didn't understand it as a tool to help do other things. And all those other things were about making your own business. Make your own business in what, right? I had all these questions about why are we teaching students how to use technology or build technology without content at the center of it? What are you doing it for? What is your purpose? How are you going to tell good stories in whatever discipline you want to do it? How will you know how to use these tools? And what are the ethics behind just having technology for its own sake in a region where we are already resource deficient, right? So all those questions were coming up for me about the way, the frame that was given to information technology at a national level, and it's sort of a sort of rescue mission to use ICT to sort of save the economies of this Caribbean without any direct path to sustainability or to the language about creativity at the center of it as well. I also really was interested in using the library as place, text, and tool. It was a really important space for me. It's an important space for the students, and I thought that students were really disconnected with it. Most students in my classroom, when I started teaching at Dominica State College in 2014, I've taught digital humanities research 5 times since I've been in Dominica. Every time I start a class, no one has a library card. Few students have ever been to the library. Well, they go to the library. It's where you go after school and you tell your parents you're going to do work, but you're really going to hang out with your friends, right? And then they know where it is, but they've probably never been inside. And then the third thing is that they don't know where the documentation center and the archives are. So I literally have to give instructions as part of the class to get to the location. They have no idea. Their relationship with the library is completely disconnected. And as most students in our classrooms all over the world, their idea of research is Google first, right? So we all have that generational problem that we're dealing with in our classrooms, despite the location. And I was also really interested in getting things, like I said, tricking the students into being makers and tricking them into really taking ownership of their history. My students are watching. They'll tell you it worked. They can type in the box and tell you it worked. Allowing them to spend enough time uninstructed, unbothered by assessments with these historical records, with the content, with the Caribbean literature, and seeing what happens. Having them ask questions, having them come up with ideas about how they can use this information for themselves. And then what happens is that they get a stronger sense of their national pride and their national, their history as a result of that. So those things were really important to my desire to start Create Caribbean and what was designed in the mission. I will take you through the website in a little bit so you can see some of the points there that we will talk about next. And what I ended up doing in that space is really creating something that was thinking about the digital divide, that students would come into this program for whatever reason and not have technology at home. And how would I create a program that would allow them to be equally benefiting from that space? That I would want them to think about their access, their relationship with piracy in a foreign country that doesn't have access to things. We have a big piracy issue going on, and there's sort of this vigilante pirate movement in places around the world that really feel and sense this disparity in access. Even in our classrooms, when we want to do research on something, I pay for JSTOR as a private member because we don't have an institutional subscription. And JSTOR is one of the only places we can do that. We don't have any other place where we can access as individual scholars or independent scholars behind a paywall. So their access to research, their relationship with research changes because they can't get to anything, right? Once they start that research and they get something they're really excited about, they stop. So I have to send them back to the archives and tell them, okay, well, you need to go to see our local things and see what something there might be more valuable than what you're trying to reach. And then they find something, and then we go from there. So we have all these experiences where we're trying to get them to do that. And then we talk about intellectual property. One of the pillars of Create Caribbean is decided that the students own what they make. Create Caribbean is really big on having community ownership of the work. Our students get credit. They become authors of the work that is produced on the sites and all the projects that we do. If they participate in editing any of the code. They get credit for that. And so they become more vigilant about what they're doing in engaging with the knowledge that they're experiencing. They become very professional in their interactions with the librarians, and they become more refined in what they're asking for when they go into those spaces. They have a little more responsibility about, because at the end of the day, this is public all times, and this belongs to them. So it really changes how very quickly what started as just giving them one little assignment, this long-term project-based learning changes it for them, because then it's my work, and it's really important to me, and I need you to take it seriously, and I want all these investments. And then the next part is the dissemination. They go into the schools, into primary schools, into secondary schools, and they present this work to students who then get excited about what they're seeing and what they're hearing. And of course, it's all the bells and whistles, right? So they come and they present this nice fancy website, and they say, hey, guys, we made this. And so the kids in the room are like, hey, I want to do that too. And then it's a cycle. So I've already seen the cycle sort of start to move, where the kids are getting excited just by the visual aids, but then they come in and they grab the content, and then it moves them into the program over and over again. So we have all those elements at play in what's happening at Create Caribbean. And the outcomes are very, very clear. It has also really pushed the library system and the library service to be more active in making things available. I used to have this fight. When I first moved to Dominica for the first 2 years, I was fighting with the librarians every day. I'm like, why do you have this here if we can't see it? You know, I'm the scholar. I come in, I yell at them, and they tell me, you have to protect the things need to be protected. You can't touch it, you can see it. I'm like, well, it doesn't exist, right? We have this fight for a year, and then we're like, okay, we have to stop fighting. What can we do? And we really worked well together and figured out a way for us to have this sharing. One of it involved a lot of training of the students, getting them to understand the culture. We also use Omeka as for many, many of our projects. And Omeka is open source, but it also uses library metadata that is translatable across all kinds of fields and all kinds of contexts. So the students really have a relationship now to the way librarians use information, and so they have a better appreciation of the work that goes into making sure that things are well preserved and their interactions with those documents and so on. So the librarians then started to trust us a little more and give us a little more access little by little. And so this relationship now is a really, we've grown to love each other very much. And so one of the really important things about this is that now the librarians, when students come to do research at the library, they send them to our website. So it's a win-win situation, right? We're having people go to them, and they're having people come to, they're sending traffic to our sites, and that is working out really, really well for us. But I want to return to this thinking about the archive to show you in real time what I was able to push my students to achieve in Create Caribbean by thinking about different types of archives that we were able to create. And I have sort of given an identity to these different archives that were created in the process of bringing together this sense of wanting to read and encounter text for the first time, whatever type of text it is, whether it's literature or history, wanting to have public spaces for these activities to occur, and also wanting to sort of preserve for a next generation and a generation after that. And I looked at 4 different types of archives. The teleological archive, and this is about the Bildungsroman, right? This is who am I, who is this nation? So we're talking about nationalism, self-identification, and we have some projects that speak directly to that. I will show you. Then we talk about the spatial archive, groundedness in a particular space and a particular history, thinking about the physical space of Dominica, and projects that are centered on tying the history directly to the land. And we have some projects that have done this very well. We look at the mobile archive. This is the idea of creating community and not waiting for the knowledge to come to you, but bring the knowledge to everyone else. And we've done this by really creating programs that, this is more in our programming than in our projects. Our signature program is our Create and Code Technology Education Program. It's for students 6 to 16. And what they do is coding with some type of social justice or social awareness theme in mind. And they do it in summers, they do it on Saturdays. It's a good time. I have students who are now in the equivalent of 10th grade who started with us the first year when they were 10. So, and they've still been coming back every single year for this camp. So it's really the most successful thing that we've done, believe it or not. But that tells us something about generationally what we need to prepare the students, because once they're finished with that, they're like, okay, when I get out of high school, I'm going to come to Cray Caribbean and I'm going to be an intern there. So they sort of have this relationship already. They already know the work we do. They have a relationship to the material. And they then will have the technical experience in coding to come in and just do work. So I'm waiting for 2 more years. So I'll have the first set of already trained people in all HTML, CSS, everything we're giving them, and they can just come and get right to work, and I wouldn't have to do that training at the college level, right? So that's fun. And then we also have the reflective archive, and this, for me, is my personal favorite part of the blog, of the projects, is the interns blog. The interns are required as part of the internship program to blog on their experiences periodically throughout the school year. They will write maybe 2 blogs per semester on whatever projects we're working on at the time. And this, because of how busy I am, as you heard, and because I don't get to spend as much time with them as I would like, I always get to read their blogs for the first time and see what's in their head and how they're feeling and thinking about the projects, because it's really free form. It's really a reflection of their process, primarily. So they're thinking about process. They're not necessarily asked to summarize their projects because you have access to those projects. But I'm really asking them to reflect on what they are learning about themselves, their country, their work habits, their identity through this process of doing the work. And it's really, really enlightening. We have blogs for the last 3 years. You can go back and read all of it, and you will see that in action. So as I've outlined them here for you, I will now try to, they said this was going to be easy, but we shall see. To go to the website to give you some sense of it. So this is the Dominica Library and Information Services site. It's a brand new website. I used to judge them so fiercely with the website when I first saw it. And I begged them to get a new website, and they did. And I am pleased. I would like for them to also get a new building. But the politics surrounding the building, you know, we live in an environment where after Hurricane Maria happened, everything is an urgency. And so the government is in a position where they have to make really hard decisions about what comes first and second. So the library is housed under the Ministry of Education, which means we have to get all the schools open first before. And so it's a chicken and egg question. Do we really need libraries when we need schools? But what are they going to read when they were out of school for 8 weeks or more? And the library was basically having to take children into a makeshift space to take time because children were not in school. So we have all these sort of post-disaster issues that we're dealing with. The timeline on the repair, we really want a new building, but we really like the old one for its historical value. So there is a national debate that has been sort of existing at the, under the surface about what is going to happen for the library. But right now, everyone is housed, including circulation, in the National Archives and Documentation Center building, and they're open for operations. So I just wanted to give you a sense of that. But in terms of Cray Caribbean, you will see that I just want to emphasize that what we're doing is for students by students. When people hear Cray Caribbean, they think that I am doing a lot of the work, and I am doing a lot of the work, but part of the work that I'm doing is really getting the students to be more independent about their education and to be more confident in what they are able to produce, just on the merits of their trusting their own intellect, right? And this is a particularly important mission, given what I've already said about this relationship of knowledge, knowledge production in the Caribbean, and power, and even these threats of climate change that we're talking about. Because at some point, the students are going to leave for higher education. This is the nature of our region. And we are creating, the biggest export in the Caribbean is human resource. So we want to really create an incentive and an environment where students feel their creativity is valued, they feel that their intellect is valued in the community where they are from, that they can live there and work there and produce there and have it reach a global audience like you and have it be as valuable as anything else that was produced if they were in a university in the United States or somewhere else, right? This is a very, very important part of the mission of what I do. And this is why I have very little interaction. However controlling I might want to be about the final product, This is why I have very little interaction with the process, as much as I can avoid it, and I let them rise and fall as they may. And they fall and they get up, and every time they get up, and they do it over and over again. So it's very important for us to see the students doing that. Some of the projects, one of the projects that I'm most proud of is this Dominica History Project. The Dominica History Project is an annual project. We did not do one last year for obvious reasons. It is a collaboration with the Division of Culture in Dominica. And we were invited to collaborate on it because the Division of Culture wanted to sort of reach a different audience or to enhance the quality of its product for History Week, which is an annual event tied to independence. And we were charged with a theme. Every year we get a different theme, and they tell us, we want you to build a resource that is web-based. And then we're talking to people who are not digital humanists, who don't understand what you, tell me build a resource that is web-based. I can give you, what do you want? I mean, we can do a lot of things here, right? So what did we do the first year? We did all the things, right? We did timelines, we did mapping, we created an entire archive, we did all the things. So we pulled out all the bells and whistles. So this site is actually WordPress on top of Omeka with a link to some Drupal stuff. We have a Joomla in the back. There's a lot of stuff going on there. It's big, right? Because this was the first time we were like, okay, we're going to impress everyone. We use a lot of Night Lab timeline on this one. So you will see that we created, a lot of these documents were originally scanned by us. I work at the Chronicle, as you heard, so I had access to the archives that are not in the National Library's holdings. And so we were allowed to scan some of those original documents. My family also owns quite a bit of the original archives that you will see on the site particularly from the 1960s and 70s independence movements, because my uncles were a part of that movement. So I actually have them in a plastic bin in my house. The hurricane did not take them. It's great. So a lot of the stuff that you see here has, we also got a lot of information from the Digital Library of the Caribbean. So you will see as up here where we got a lot of the data. So we're using and I want to emphasize this particular point because it comes back to my original idea. How can we make nice things if we cannot get to the nice things? Everything here is open source, open access, because we can't afford anything. Or we couldn't at that time. We can afford a little bit of nice things now. But we could afford nothing at that time. And so everything here, Night Lab at Northwestern University builds this JS software for us to use. So we use a lot of Story Map from Night Lab and Timeline from Night Lab so far. That's one of the tools that we use on here. But we also have the archive in the back, which is built entirely on Omeka. I have about 12 Omeka experts now, which is great. They can build anything, they can crack anything. I believe in them. They can break it. And we use Neatline for a lot of our projects as well, which is one of our favorite plugins. We are trying to break Neatline now to make it do something we really, really want it to do. So if we do that, we will call the Scholars Lab and say, talk to us. We have something for you. But the students are getting very good. And I'm going to make one more point about this, is that I have students coming in as economics majors who have never used an Excel spreadsheet before. It's multidisciplinary, it's interdisciplinary. Most of the students, I had a nice cohort where I had a couple people who were real interested in programming. I maybe always have one or two who do design, web development, and programming, but for the most part, the interns are not experts at any IT, computer science, anything like that, and they learn what they need to learn. It would be nice to have a programmer, but we do pretty well with having novices at this level learn from the ground up how to do it. They all have to learn the software that we teach in the Create and Code, whether they're active instructors or they're just here to help the students or take them to the bathroom. So everyone is learning all the things all the time. We also have, when we think about this spatial archive, I wanted to point to Maroon Country. This is a work in progress, and we kind of put it on hold because Maroon Country is another name we call Dominica in the 1700s. It's a section right in the Central Forest Reserve where all the Maroons hid. in Dominica, and so that's the inspiration for this name. The students actually wrote a short story. We're going to actually publish it, and all the illustrations were done by the students in the program. So we have all these elements, which are archival records, pictures, correspondences between the British government and the local government about the maroon activity on the island. So we're going to be expanding this project a lot, but is this one of the most interesting projects because we actually went on a hike to Maroon Country as part of this exercise when we were first starting this site. So there's a lot of tactile things happening along with the actual digital experience because they want to build a game app as part of their project, and they really had to kind of get a sense of the space, the spatial dynamics of the forest. They were not excited about the hike, but they came out with a really good sense of what it meant to actually live in that space, and sort of their response after that hike was really emotional and really reflective about, you know, the history of Dominica and the sort of resistance movements that have happened historically in that space. So this is another one of the projects that really tied them. And then, of course, this one is mine. It's my favorite. It's Imagine Homeland, because it's literary, and this is one of the projects that we worked on. We started mapping novels that were written by Dominicans about Dominica, or any novel that was written with Dominica as a central location. And we were going to do this. We plan to do this for multiple countries to look at the geographies of it. So we've already started working on it. Particularly, we started with one novel, The Orchid House, because they were launching a new edition in 2016, and I wrote the introduction for that. So this was the first book we used to do this exercise, and it really looked at how Dominica was represented in novels as a physical location. So it really has them thinking about, people were writing about Dominica in the 1890s, people were writing Dominica in the 1950s. What are they writing about? What is familiar to you? What is it about this space that makes it yours? And can you identify in history? And how do you plan to have this sort of legacy continue in writing? So this novel is really mapped about the three girls in the book and where they travel to. So you have all these other examples of that on this site. And then I will just end with this project, which will take me back to the slides. This is the most important project that we're working on right now. It's called Carry Sealand. And Carry Sealand is an environmental and sustainability project. This project is the brainchild of Unia Kempadu, my novelist friend. And Unia could just call me after this festival. She's like, you know all the tech things, and I know none of the tech things, and we're going to do this thing together. And this is where this project started. But one of the basis of this project was to create a map that would help us locate any resource. It can be an artistic resource, a governmental resource, a place, a site, a natural resource that had anything to do with preserving the environment or was centered around the natural resources of each particular country. And so we started with Dominica, but you can see we have about 12 countries mapped so far. This is why we want to break Neatline, because Neatline will not let us do the layers we want to do in the way we want to do them. But we're getting there. We will break it soon. So we have all these different locations and these narratives tied to them over time. And this one is what everyone is working on this, particularly in light of Hurricane Maria. We've expanded this project to include multiple parts. You can read about it on the website. And we're always looking for collaborators on there. But this was one of the projects that became really interesting because days before the Hurricane Maria hit, I brought them into class and I said, we're going to work on this project because global warming is real and the world is falling apart. And 4 days later, Hurricane Maria hit. I told you something's wrong with me. Right? The students said that after they said, you told us this again, and here we go. Monday, the hurricane hit. So this is an urgency, and one of the reasons that I'm returning to this project, despite the fact that it's not literary or necessarily historical, there is a history of the importance of the nature and environment to our cultural will in the Caribbean. I just talked to you about how the Maroons actively use nature as resistance, right? And it's really important at all levels that we engage the humanities to ask the important questions about how we create alternative ways of living in the Caribbean. And so this is one of the reasons why this project has become a larger focus for this year. It does not necessarily detract from that because we have multiple modes of storytelling happening on there. We'll have documentaries. There will be some more digital mapping happening on this project and so on. But it is built on these principles for alternative Caribbean archives: community accountability, sustainable living, planetary responsibility. These are the principles that my students came up with after we read the UN 17 goals and decided they were too much, and you don't need all that if you're going to live your life right. So we have 3. So these were the 3 that we agreed on that as a community we would practice together. And we would practice it in the ethics of our community building, but we would also practice in the ethics of our digital humanities work. And we take that very, very seriously in the terms of how we use technology. One of the things that we highlighted after that was we cannot rely solely on internet access to do our work. We have to figure out other ways to do this work to make it, because we didn't have internet access. I still don't have internet access at home following Hurricane Maria. I don't have broadband internet access at home. We only rely on mobile data at this time for most, I want to say 95% of the country, and that is, mobile data is expensive. It adds up. So one of the things that we're thinking about is how can we be accountable as a community that cannot afford data? How do we make them still feel invested in this work and still feel this buying into creating a different type of lifestyle and different type of life where we can talk about Octavia Butler and Unia Kempadu and all of these things in a space where they feel the same kind of urgency and the same kind of responsibility for their planet, for the space that they occupy in the world, and for their own histories as well. And that's why the question of preserving histories becomes important. And part of this project, as we go forward, just for me to conclude, is part of these projects following Carrie Sealand or in conjunction with Carrie Sealand will be to engage the library more actively in these questions about preservation. So what are we going to do in those activities? We are establishing a long-term partnership in which these younger citizens are taking ownership of their indigenous knowledges. So they're actively doing what we call history harvest, going into communities, intergenerational conversation, doing these digital recordings, oral histories, creating this content, and making it available on social media and other platforms so that it will be easily accessible. Most of our sites, and including this one, will have contributor pages where we invite people in the diaspora to submit and to ask questions of our content, or to clarify our content, or to have relationships with some of the content in there, depending on long-lost family members, et cetera, et cetera. And then we also want to talk about repatriation in a real way with the library system. We've already started that conversation. I know there's a lot of work in Black studies, Black digital humanities studies happening around the questions of repatriation around the world, so the Black Atlantic in general. There are a lot of scholars working on that right now. But I think in general, bringing knowledge is from people's homes. A lot of what we find in the Caribbean is this suspicion about the ownership of knowledge is a real problem. And so when we go to talk to generations of people who we know, like a generation before me, who we know have a lot of valuable archives, they're resistant to share it. They're holding it in their houses because they're afraid someone is going to come take it and take it away to somewhere else. What are you going to do with it is always the question I get, right? There's this sort of large suspicion around ownership of knowledge, and rightly so. So we're trying to work with the communities and individuals that we know to resolve that problem and to take this idea of public humanities very seriously, because before, we didn't have a Caribbean that doesn't have a scholarly community in action at all times, and that makes it hard for somebody to say, you're going to come do research on my thing, what do you want with that, right? So we have to really build that trust. And then another project is to really create a space where we can have them come and bring in their vernacular artifacts and so on. One of the things we're really interested in, and I make reference to the British census research that was happening, is we want people to bring in their old birth records, baptismal records, their old British passports. So there are a lot of people who are British citizens because they were born in colonies. Their old, all these records are to become part of the archive. A lot of people, we had 2 fires in our civil registry in the 1970s, and a lot of people lost their birth certificates and don't even remember when they were born, if they were not baptized in the Catholic Church and cannot find a record of it there. So we have all these examples in the past of threats to our historical record in Dominica alone, right? And I could go on and on about the other islands. So there is a real need, either these hurricanes or these other threats that have come up, and we have a lot of political activity that drives a lot of uprisings that can lead to the destruction of these records. So we think that digital humanities really allows us to find ways to create urgency around this preservation and to keep the students engaged as citizens responsible for the continuity of that and to democratize knowledge in libraries and in schools and in the nation as a whole. So thank you very much for listening. I hope we can talk more about some of the topics you have here. If you have questions, I'm happy to answer.